Sat in exactly the right place. Good evening. Good to see you all. Has everyone had a good weekend? It's been boiling, hasn't it? There's a quite bit of a shine on me now, you know. I'm Darren, I'm from AlchemyFlow. For those of you that don't know what AlchemyFlow is about, you know, I'm a food and health education project based in Brighton with a kind of particular focus on the fermentation arts. And beyond the workshop facilitation, I'm also a bit of a small producer of fermented food, so please buy my stuff on the way out, bit of product placement there. It really helps to support and platform, you know, some of this work that we do. What to say about this event? I mean, this is obviously quite a big event for me this year, so I'm like feeling the heat a little bit, so do bear with me. But this is also part of a series of workshops that are going on throughout the year. So in a few weeks' time I've got Simon Poffley coming down. Guys, if you want to come in closer, you're more than welcome, there's plenty of space. I know a lot of you are local, it's really beautiful to see some familiar faces here that have been in workshop with me in the past, so if you can get to those events, please do, it'd be nice to see you. So I just want to say a few thanks before I start off, because again, this being the kind of event that it does, I really want to say a big heartfelt thanks to Silo and particularly Douglas McMaster, because you know, this restaurant has really platformed my work for nearly 2 years now since I began, and really without it I couldn't have done the work that I've done, and I definitely couldn't produce ferments in the way that I do, so thank you very much. You know, I'm constantly surprised here really by the generosity and the dedication of the staff, and particularly in low points I'm really always inspired by your ethic, Doug, and your philosophy, not just about bringing the zero waste ethic into the mainstream, but also about cultivating this respect and sensitivity for the land through food, which is a notion that's really close to my heart, and I would hope to us all too. So really thanks for Silo for providing this space. Also want to say hello to Old Tree Brewery that are here as well, that are providing the drinks this evening. Old Tree are an amazing project that work up on Lewis Road. They're a local botanical drinks making cooperative. I was going to call you a company then. But their work is all about funneling their profits back into land regeneration and food forestry. So they've got a real pioneering project up on Lewis Road as part of Field Brighton. The land is currently being repurposed at the moment by the developers, so they're losing that space. Have you found new space now? No, you're still looking. But the reason I'm mentioning that is because they need your cash. So I think more dollars directed in that direction towards that project will really help the transition to a new space to do the work that they need to do much easier. And just a quick wave and hello as well to the other small producers of ferments that are here this evening. Olivia Wall, where are you, Olivia? From Wild Cultures, who's been doing fermentation workshops in the community for quite some time now, and also Alex Catchpole, who's here too. Alex, you around? In the audience, who runs Organergy, that also has been doing workshops. Check out his new workshop, The Magic of the Microbiome, that has really made some waves locally. So a little bit about tonight, and our guest. So I think it was in 2013 when I first really came across fermentation, which was about working on my own health and a gut issue that I was working with at the time. And I'm sure many of us here have had those failed attempts at fermentation in our experiments, and I was no stranger to that. I moved out of a housing cooperative in Brighton not too long ago, and just before I moved out, I had to face one of my neglected fermentation experiments in the airing cupboard there, which was basically this like creature of mould that had evolved from the like milk kefir. So you know, you can probably guess I was quite a popular cooperative member there where I lived. But beyond that, I mean, you know, I received a list from our guest this last week about a ferment that I had to put together, which put me into that stage of like, am I qualified for this? Like, this guy is like this fermentation superstar, and I'm trying to, like, you know, make the ferment that he's going to be demonstrating this evening. But you know, I think our guest's work this evening really came to me an important time when food became a real critical component to self-nurturing and really understanding what I understood about ecology, what I understood about the human body, what I understood about health, and also my relationship to nature. And I think it also came across as a bit of a manifesto, and I see Tom like nodding his head at the back. It was a real manifesto for me in terms of what an archaic revival of food was all about. So an archaic revival of food about reconnecting, reviving, and recapturing skills like fermentation as a food politic in a way, as an antidote to the commodification of food that is very much part of our contemporary food culture. So it was a really, really, really important work. I think it was in 2000, it was around 2000, our guest published, I'm using our guest because I'm going to do like this fanfare thing where it's like his name's actually Sandor Katz a little bit later on, but anyway, we'll leave that one alone. But I remember when I first picked up your book, you know, I think what makes this privilege of hosting this event even more important for me tonight is that we share a connection, a common connection through global queer community, which I think we both call home to some degree. And I actually picked Wild Fermentation up on a bookshelf in London, which was belonged to someone that we're kind of mutually connected to through community. So it was a really kind of important moment. But beyond Wild Fermentation, that was published in 2002, and after the thousands of fermentation workshops that this guy has done around the world, you know, Sandor is very much, I guess, responsible for the cultural revival of fermentation in the West to some degree. He then went on to publish The Art of Fermentation in 2012, which, by the way, we have a few copies here if you want to purchase for signing later on, come and see me. But that was published in 2012, and that made some significant and huge waves in our kind of contemporary food culture in the West. Now, and it became a New York Times bestseller, actually, so that was pretty cool. But the New York Times, in that sense, actually described you as one of the unlikely rock stars of the American food scene, but I prefer to think of you a little bit as a microbial sorcerer of the highest order. So without further ado, thanks all very much for coming this evening. It really means so much to me, and I want to introduce you, Mr. Sandor Katz.
Okay, I love having this word behind my head. Okay. Well, it's a great honor to be here, and I've been to Silo in Australia, and what I just realized today is this is the last workshop of sort of a month of kind of action-packed travel around Europe and the UK. And I just realized that the event that I did at Silo in Melbourne about 5 years ago was at the end of a kind of grueling 3-week tour of Australia. So I don't know, you know, what this means, that Silo is like the place for my kind of, you know, decompression at the end of a lot of hard work, but I'm very happy to be here. So before I wrap up, I'm going to sort of demonstrate a pao tsai. We have some pao tsai to try, and that's like the Chinese version of fermented vegetables. But I want to talk a little bit first, meander a little bit. I'm going to try to not take up too much time because I want to leave some time to be more interactive, and I'm sure people have come with questions or things I say might trigger questions, so know that there will be some time for that. I mean, one issue that I've been very interested in is, people keep on asking me questions along the lines of fermentation as a new food trend of 2017 or 2016, and I just feel so emphatically that there is nothing new about fermentation as a food trend. I mean, certainly there's no denying that, there is heightened awareness of fermentation, there's heightened interest in fermentation, and I'm so excited about that, and I'm glad that people are thinking more about their food and becoming more, aware of the processes that go into their food. But, almost every individual in almost every part of the world eats and drinks products of fermentation every day. Like, it is not a practice that's only for people, sort of with a heightened consciousness about food. If you're addicted to coffee like I am and start your day with a cup of coffee, coffee is fermented. If your breakfast typically consists of some kind of bread is fermented. If you put some kind of cheese on that bread, cheese is fermented. If you eat a sandwich for lunch that might include salami or some other kind of cured meat is fermented. If you put mustard on that sandwich, the vinegar that stabilizes mustard and all of our other modern condiments is fermented, and the ancient condiments of the world are definitely fermented. That would be things like fish sauce, soy sauce. The word ketchup is an old Chinese word for fish sauce that actually was reinterpreted in England and then again in the United States. So condiments are fermented, chocolate is fermented, vanilla is fermented, obviously all alcoholic beverages are fermented. Before they had carbon dioxide machines, all carbonated soft drinks were fermented, as is still somewhat alive in Britain in the form of ginger beer. And of course, all these wonderful sort of new fermented soft drinks that we're enjoying here tonight. Everybody everywhere eats products of fermentation every day. Now, what we now understand, according to the archaeological record, there's evidence of fermentation on pottery shards that have been dated back more than 9,000 years. So we know that humans have been practicing some form of intentional fermentation for at least that long. For the first 9,000 and some 100 years of fermentation, there was no scientific analysis, or maybe people had various ideas about what was happening, but it's barely 150 years ago that Louis Pasteur definitively identified fermentation as a biological process and started identifying and distinguishing between some of the different organisms of fermentation. And you don't need to know anything about microbiology to practice fermentation, but microbiology has illuminated fermentation in very interesting ways. And so, the question always arises, why is fermentation practiced everywhere? And I should just say as an asterisk, I do not have encyclopedic knowledge. Like, I don't know about every culinary tradition on the earth, but I've been looking for counterexamples. And I have not been able to come up with a single counterexample of a culinary tradition that does not incorporate fermentation. Until that trip to Australia, people used to say, oh, the Aboriginal people of Australia never developed any fermentation processes. And then on that trip, I went on a wild foods walk with an Aboriginal man, and the very first plant we stopped to talk about was a tree, and there were nuts under the tree, and we picked up the nuts, and he said, don't eat them, they're poisonous. They're not safe to eat until you soak them in water for a few days. Well, guess what happens when you soak a dry food in water? You initiate fermentation, and actually detoxification is a very important application of fermentation. And there are foods in every part of the world that are poisonous to eat without fermentation. So the Aboriginal people of Australia actually were using fermentation to detoxify these nuts. I also found examples of alcohol made from the sap of a tree in Tasmania. So, there went that theory. So I haven't been able to come up with any examples of culinary traditions that do not incorporate fermentation. So, I believe fermentation is more or less universal. I mean, certainly in the past there might have been, sort of societies of hunter-gatherers who weren't fermenting anything, if you're spending each day procuring the resources that are going to get you through that day, then the dynamics of how food ages over time are not very important to you. But, I would suggest that, agriculture would not be possible without fermentation, because how could people ever invest themselves in crops that are ready at a certain point of the year if they didn't have effective strategies to enable those crops to feed them throughout the rest of the year? So, my idea about why fermentation is practiced everywhere is the simple idea that is very well established now, that, all of the plants and all of the animal products that make up our food are populated by microorganisms. And so microbial transformation of our food is more or less an inevitability. If our food is dry, it doesn't happen, like, mature grains or legumes. If you keep them dry and cool, they're very stable just in their mature state. But anything else, any food that has any moisture content will eventually decompose. So everybody has experience. You don't have to be a fermenter. Everybody has experience in their kitchens of cleaning up food at the back of the refrigerator that began to decompose, and this can give us some insight into the inevitability of microbial transformation of our food. But one of the interesting realities that microbiology has illuminated is that all of the food that we eat is populated not by one single kind of microorganism, but by vast multitudes of different kinds of organisms. And some of these organisms could decompose the food into a disgusting mess that nobody would ever think about putting into their mouths. Some of the organisms can actually stabilize food and make it last for varying periods of time. Some of the microorganisms can generate flavors that we find incredibly delicious. Some of the microorganisms can decompose or break down toxins in food, or digest nutrients that are too dense in some way for our bodies to effectively access. But the big question is, which organisms are going to develop, and what the practice of fermentation amounts to, are manipulations of environmental conditions that have the effect of encouraging the growth of certain kinds of organisms and simultaneously discouraging the growth of other kinds of organisms. And so, to me, the miracle is that, our ancestors, without having the benefit of, microscopes and knowing the names of microorganisms and the qualities of different organisms, just figured out by observation and trial and error, what kinds of conditions improve the food. So, in the practice of fermentation, there's always a practical benefit. Your food is not decomposing, and you're deriving some practical benefit beyond that. So, one benefit might be alcohol. I mean, I don't know that everyone would agree that that's practical, but, certainly that's desirable. People enjoy altering their consciousness, and the only way that alcohol is produced is through the action of fermentation. Beyond alcohol, preservation. I mean, for us in the 21st century, we have such a warped sense of food preservation. Like, we can't even imagine what you would do with perishable foods without refrigerators that, our great-grandparents lived their lives without. So it's not that many generations. And certainly in 2017, most households on planet Earth do not have a refrigerator. Refrigeration really remains sort of the province of, the more affluent parts of the world and the more affluent people in the less affluent parts of the world. So beyond refrigeration and freezers, some of us might be thinking about, canned food. That's sort of an old-timey method of food preservation. Maybe we, sort of watched a grandparent, who was doing some kind of canning. Canning is really the opposite of fermentation. It's sterilizing food in a jar. But that was, the patent for canning was issued in France in 1812. If you go back more than 200 years, then there's no canning. There's no sterilized food in a jar. So, if you take away freezers and refrigerators and sterilize food in a jar, there are not many methods of food preservation left. There's drying, where you can take, fish or meat or fruit or vegetables or anything and, remove the moisture from it, either in the sun or now in a dehydrator. and that will stabilize food, not by killing the microorganisms, but by depriving them of the water that they need in order to function. And then beyond that, there's fermentation. And fermentation just has been incredibly important. And we might think of cheese as primarily sort of a flavor enhancement of milk, but historically the importance of cheese is it's a strategy to use fermentation in order to preserve milk and extend its useful life. Salamis and other kinds of cured meats are strategies using fermentation along with salting and drying to preserve the useful life of meat, and on all the fermented vegetables, sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles. These are strategies for preserving vegetables, and particularly for northern places with very short growing seasons and very long winters, fermented vegetables they've meant survival. So in places like Russia and Poland and the northern parts of China and Korea and Japan, all these places with limited growing seasons, fermentation has been a strategy for survival. So people could have vegetables and vitamin C, the essential plant-based nutrient, throughout the long winter. Here in the UK, Captain James Cook was, recognized as conquering scurvy because, he started bringing big barrels of sauerkraut on his, long exploratory voyages. And the other day we met some people who sail ships with like a sailboat, like a small sailboat with cargo across the ocean. And the way they're able to sort of maintain their nutrition on that journey is same way as Captain Cook did, with barrels of sauerkraut. Beyond preservation, I should just talk about flavor. All the most compelling flavors in the world are products of fermentation. You walk into a gourmet food store anywhere, and most of what you're going to see are products of fermentation. Not everybody loves every flavor of fermentation. I would say collectively these are what we could describe as acquired tastes. Whoever liked their first glass of beer, whoever liked their first cup of coffee. I think cheese illustrates this in a really accessible way. So, I'll bet most people here, unless we have some vegans, enjoy some kind of cheese at least some of the time. But once you start getting into some of the stronger, kind of stinkier cheeses that you could smell from across the street, it's probably like a narrower a group of us that can enjoy them. And as my taste has evolved, I go crazy for cheeses like that. If I can smell it from a long way away, I'm excited to taste it. And once in a while, I'll splurge and I'll buy a piece of really ripe, stinky cheese, and I'll bring it home and invite some friends over to share with me. And some of my friends can really enjoy that with me. But I've learned over time that some people will get to the door and they'll smell it and they'll make a face and they'll say, "Did something die in here?" And, they would never ever think about putting something like that in their mouths. And the world is full of notorious fermented foods that people who have grown up not eating them just can't really wrap themselves around. Like if you go to Sweden, somebody might offer you some surströmming, which is fermented herring. There's a low salt fermented herring, and it's got very, very strong aroma. I was first exposed to it actually here in the UK about 10 years ago. I was at a conference in Oxford, the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, and this Swedish food writer was doing a presentation about surströmming, and she brought some surströmming. And in contemporary production, it's done in cans, and unlike all other canned foods, which are heat processed and sterilized, it's sealed in the can, fresh and alive, and you know when it's ready when the can bulges. So this woman had this like stack of bulging cans of surströmming, and then she was going to open them, but there was like a sort of huddle of the conference organizers, and they decided they couldn't do it in the building, that the building would never recover, and they needed to move the tasting outside. And and I mean, you could smell it from 50 yards away. I mean, it was a very, very powerful aroma, and actually, like, I loved it. It left this aftertaste for me. Yeah, first of all, you don't eat it alone. Like any of these really strongest flavored foods, like you don't drink fish sauce like by the glass. You use a little bit of it as a seasoning, and it's very, very powerful. But you make this little sandwich, flatbread, sour cream, onion, a little piece of surströmming, and it's really wonderful. It left this aftertaste, and ever since, whenever I've had the opportunity to taste it, I've tried some more. But not everybody loves it. A lot of people are very put off by it, and I would say, particularly when we're talking about animal foods, high protein foods. Like many ferments of high protein foods can result in fermentation byproducts that just remind us of decomposition of bodies. And I think that this is why people find them so off-putting sometimes. Then beyond flavor, beyond preservation, what's getting many people interested in fermentation at the present moment is health. So I want to address a little bit some of the kind of nutritional qualities of fermentation. And fermented foods and beverages are so varied that it's very hard to generalize. It's not as if chocolate and sourdough bread and coffee and sauerkraut and kombucha all have the same qualities. Like they're all different food. Like fermentation is a very kind of diverse realm of human experience. But the process of fermentation definitely transforms foods in some very clear patterns. And the first thing I would say is pre-digestion. Nutrients are broken down by the fermentation while the food is fermenting. Lactose, the milk sugar that so many people have a hard time with, gets broken down during fermentation to varying degrees in different kinds of ferments, but it's broken down. Like that's what makes the acidic flavor of yogurt, is the lactic acid being broken down into the lactose being broken down into lactic acid and other fermentation byproducts. Soybeans. I think that this is the most vivid illustration of the idea of pre-digestion. I mean, the reason why the vegetarian subcultures of the West adopted soybeans as a replacement for meat and milk is that it's considered to be the most concentrated protein of any plant source food. But you really never see people like soaking soybeans, cooking them until they're soft enough to eat, and then sitting down for dinner and eating a big bowl of soybeans, the way you might with lentils or chickpeas or lots of other kinds of beans. And the reason is that soybeans are totally indigestible to us. Like we cannot access their protein with our human digestive systems. So the Asian cultures that pioneered soy agriculture figured out all of these different ways of processing the soybeans to make them more their nutrients more accessible. Primarily fermentation, but not exclusively fermentation. But some examples of fermented soybeans would be soy sauce, miso, tempeh, natto. If you're familiar with these four foods, like they're very different in flavor and texture. In terms of fermentation, they involve different organisms, different processes, different lengths of time. Tempeh might only take 24 hours. Miso or soy sauce will take like a year or even longer. But what they all have in common is that the protein gets broken down into amino acids. That's pre-digestion. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Gluten, the wheat protein that so many people are having a hard time with, gets broken down by fermentation, not by yeast, which is the way most contemporary breads are made, but by bacteria. And it's really important to understand that in the natural world, you never have one single kind of organism. I already like talked about the cabbage having this multitude of different organisms. Same with wheat, same with barley, same with grapes. I mean, all the sort of major foods that have been fermented throughout history, are populated by these elaborate communities of organisms. Wheat, other kinds of grains have always been fermented using the group of organisms that are on them. So yeast is always part of it, but yeast is never found in the natural world without lactic acid bacteria. Like all of the bread for the first 10,000 years of fermentation was made using this natural leavening, because no one had ever conceptualized or had any way to remove yeast from lactic acid bacteria. Louis Pasteur, one of the things he did was identify yeast and separate it and start propagating yeast as a singular entity. And that was a major technological achievement. Now in any supermarket we can buy a little packet of yeast, and you can make bread in 2 or 3 hours using a packet of yeast. And almost all of the bread you'll find in supermarkets is made with just yeast and not with the bacteria that have always accompanied yeast. But while I can appreciate that, time is money, and fast production is the imperative for mass-produced foods, this bread is kind of lacking. And the reason why so many people can't eat it is because it has all this gluten. Naturally fermented breads just have a lot less gluten because the gluten is consumed by the bacteria. And this just makes it more easily digestible for us. Pre-digestion. Minerals become more bioavailable. I mean, if you compare sourdough bread to pure yeasted bread, if you compare dosas, the Indian fermented crepes made out of lentils and rice, if you compare the mineral levels, the measurable iron and calcium and other dietary mineral levels in the unfermented versions with the fermented versions, there's always much higher levels of minerals because of pre-digestion. The minerals get kind of liberated. They're bound in these chemical bonds that our bodies are not able to break down, but fermentation can break them down before we eat them. Then I mentioned detoxification. That's another nutritional benefit of fermentation, and it's not only these poisonous bunya nuts from Australia, cassava, the tropical tubers in many parts of the world grow with high levels of cyanide and are poisonous unless they're fermented. Oxalic acid in rhubarb and spinach and chard and other vegetables gets broken down by fermentation. All kinds of toxic compounds. There's even a little bit of research looking at pesticide residues on vegetables, and it's been demonstrated that organophosphate pesticide residues get broken down during fermentation. So various kinds of compounds are detoxified. Then beyond breaking down what's in the food you start with, fermentation generates additional nutrients. Almost all fermented foods and beverages have elevated levels of B vitamins. As a result, basically, of the accumulation of microbial bodies, living or dead, they build up the B vitamin values in foods. A lot of fermented foods have K vitamins, which is sort of like a newer vitamin that nutritionists are recognizing is very, very important to our well-being. Then there are these unique micronutrients that are found in different foods, but to me the most interesting one is that fermented vegetables have these compounds called isothiocyanates that are regarded as anti-carcinogenic, that are generated by the bacteria during the fermentation. But what I would really consider to be the most profound nutritional benefit of fermentation is the bacteria themselves. So, contrary to the indoctrination that, certainly all of us who grew up in the English-speaking parts of the world in the 20th century and into the 21st century have received, that bacteria are our enemies, that bacteria need to be avoided, that when they're encountered, bacteria need to be destroyed by our, arsenal of chemicals that can do so. Science is learning that the story is much more nuanced than that. We are composed of bacteria, and it's not just us. The consensus in evolutionary biology is that all life is descended from bacteria. the corollary to this is no form of life has ever lived without bacteria. So, just as we are dependent on bacteria in order to effectively digest food, assimilate nutrients, and many other aspects of our physiology, it is being revealed. I mean, so too a cabbage and a carrot and a barley plant and a grapevine, they rely on bacteria and fungi in order to function in the world. And so, in our human bodies, each of us is host to, something like trillions of bacteria. Just mind-boggling numbers. Existing in just elaborate, broad communities that we are only beginning to scratch the surface of understanding. But it's been long understood that the bacteria in our intestines played a role in digestion, in our ability to assimilate nutrients from our food. Now we're recognizing more and more that there are all kinds of essential nutrients that bacteria synthesize within our bodies, so we don't have to find them in our food. What we think of as our immune system is mostly the work of bacteria. And it turns out that our immune systems actually need to be educated by exposure to bacteria. The leading theory as to why we're seeing this dramatic explosion in asthma and allergies among young people is from lack of exposure to bacteria, that we are overprotecting our children. Within the last year, there was this very interesting study that found that you have virtually no asthma and allergies among children who grow up on farms because they have abundant exposure to varied bacteria. Because they have contact with animals. But that a lot of kids growing up in cities just lack diverse exposure to bacteria, and so their immune systems don't fully develop, and they develop all of these autoimmune conditions, presumably as a result of lack of exposure to diverse bacteria. There's been very exciting new information where we're realizing for the first time that serotonin and lots of other chemicals that determine our brain function and neurological function are regulated by bacteria in our intestines in ways that we don't fully understand at this point. But there's clearly like a connection between what's happening in our digestion and what's happening in our brains. And there's growing recognition that a lot of the kind of neurological and mental health issues that we're seeing have some relationship to diminished biodiversity in the intestine. So, the key issue is biodiversity. First of all, most people are eating less fibrous foods and foods that contain what are now called prebiotics, polysaccharides and fibers and other kinds of nutrients that take the entire length of the intestines to be digested and thereby nourish the bacteria all the way along the intestines. And we're also all exposed to chemicals designed to kill bacteria, really on a daily basis. So, there's antibiotic drugs. I'm sure most of us have at various times in our lives taken antibiotic drugs. I'm not trying to tell you not to take antibiotic drugs. I probably wouldn't be here without the miracle of antibiotic drugs. But everybody agrees that they're overprescribed, wildly overprescribed, more so than in human population. In a lot of raising of animals, the animals are just sort of preemptively pumped up with antibiotics because it was observed 50 years ago that they grow faster on antibiotics. And so as a result of the overuse of antibiotics in healthcare and in agriculture, we're just finding it in our water increasingly, just the water table everywhere. You could buy Fiji water, whatever. All of the water has a growing accumulation of antibiotics, and we're all ingesting antibiotics at a low level on a daily basis. Antibacterial cleansing products, we've been sort of seduced to believe that soap isn't enough and we need, chemical products that kill 99.9% of bacteria, and there's really nothing sexier that a soap manufacturer can write on their packaging than sort of promising this. But what that just fails to understand is that, what do you think protects us from the 0.1% of bacteria that have the potential to make us sick? it's the 99.9% of bacteria that we coexist with perfectly well. And so, we're really at our most vulnerable when we're always like washing our skin and washing the surfaces around us with these antibacterial chemicals. Same when we take a course of antibiotics. I mean, it might knock out the specific thing that's been ailing us, but it basically increases our general vulnerability to other kinds of bacterial infections. Our main protection against bacteria are bacteria. So anyway, we all have this chemical exposure, which, thankfully doesn't kill all the bacteria in us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here to talk about this. But, what we're facing is diminished biodiversity. And usually that's something people think about, out there, in the oceans, in the rainforest, the whales, the bears, the megafauna. And I mean, that's all important. But, we also have to, think about biodiversity as something that exists within us. I would say that the greatest potential benefit of fermented foods is in restoring this biodiversity, strategies for restoring biodiversity. And, not all fermented foods have living bacteria. If you buy a can of sauerkraut in the supermarket, that was fermented with the bacteria on the cabbage, but then it underwent some kind of heat processing to be sealed in a jar. If you have a wonderful, kimchi soup at a Korean restaurant, that could be wonderful, but because it was cooked, the bacteria that were in the kimchi are no longer present. Sourdough dough, if you want to eat sourdough dough raw, that's teeming with bacteria, but who wants to eat raw dough? Once it bakes in the hot oven and it has a delicious crumb of bread, it's just no longer alive. So if you want foods with live cultures, you have to, just be a very discerning consumer. You want to eat fermented foods that have not been cooked or heat processed after their fermentation. I'm not against, by the way, kimchi stew or sauerkraut pierogies or bigos, this Polish stew of meat cooked in sauerkraut. But I would just say don't eat only that. Also eat some of the raw stuff, because that's where you get these great bacteria. Sometimes people want to know which fermented food is best. What's the most important one? And I just feel like that's completely beside the point. There is no one best fermented food. It's about biodiversity. Each different fermented food has its own unique community of organisms. And, even a sauerkraut from the cabbage from this field, wherever it was, will be a little bit different than the sauerkraut from a cabbage from that field. You mix a half a dozen different vegetables together, and you'll end up with a slightly unique community of organisms. You eat the sauerkraut at different stages of its development, you'll get different community composition. You have different lightly fermented vegetables. You have kombucha, you have water kefir, you have a water kefir with ginger and turmeric, you have a water kefir with elderflowers. I mean, just each different combination is going to have a unique microbial community. And if really the point of probiotics is biodiversity, I would just say the more different kinds of things you eat, the better. One of the most interesting studies I found bearing out the idea that probiotics, at least in terms of immune function, is really primarily about biodiversity, just found that it was only when people would eat a variety of different fermented foods. They started with a group of people who ate a lot of different fermented foods, and then they put them on a deprivation diet, and all their immune indicators went down as a result of that. And then they put them on specific probiotic yogurt and a traditional yogurt, and everybody went up a little bit, but nobody returned to the levels that they started with until they were allowed to resume diverse diets. So, I would just say in the realm of probiotic stimulation, diversity is the name of the game. Okay, so generally when I'm demonstrating fermentation, I always start with sauerkraut. And increasingly there are people who are sort of asking me to sort of address something a little bit different, because I'm thrilled to know that sauerkraut is getting more and more common, and more people understand how easy it is to make. I first learned how to make sauerkraut from a book 25 years ago. It was the first year that I'd moved from New York City, where I grew up, to rural Tennessee. I was keeping a garden for the first time. And I was such a naive city kid that it never occurred to me that in a garden all the cabbage would be ready around the same time. So my first year in the garden, that was a very interesting surprise. Like, oh my God, look, all the cabbage is ready at the same time. What are we going to do? Well, I knew I loved sauerkraut and I knew I loved sour pickles, so I just decided to learn how to make sauerkraut. And I looked in, we have this book that's like in almost every kitchen in the U.S. called The Joy of Cooking. And I looked at The Joy of Cooking, and there it was, a recipe for sauerkraut. I couldn't believe how simple it was. You shred the cabbage, you lightly salt it. As time went on, I just started doing this thing where I squeeze it. You might pound it. What you're trying to do is basically break down cell walls, release some juice, so you can get the vegetables submerged under their own juices. And then you wait. You could do it for a week. You could do it for a month. If you had a cool spot, you could do it for a year. It's a very, very flexible process. You can use any kind of vegetables. The salt ratio, usually people say around 2%, which works for most people, but there's nothing magic about that number. Salt it to taste, season it as you like, and ferment it for whatever length of time you like. All ferments exist along a spectrum. In sauerkraut, it's acids that accumulate over time. In some beverages, it might be alcohol that accumulates over time. You can make any of them less strong or more strong. And one of the great things about making it yourself is you can make it the way you like it. As I got more and more obsessed with fermentation and started reading literature about fermentation, all of the stories about all the historical stories about sauerkraut pointed to China. And the story was that the nomadic people of Central Asia encountered fermented vegetables in China and then spread the idea westward through Asia and through Europe. And for some reason, it seems like these techniques never quite jumped the channel into the UK. But certainly in the northern tier of the Eurasian landmass, everywhere there are variations of fermented vegetables. I'm sure that these have not been unknown in Britain. I mean, James Cook somehow figured out that bringing sauerkraut on his Pacific explorations was an effective way of getting vitamin C to his sailors. But it doesn't seem to have taken hold in the UK. Through the years, I learned a lot about Korean fermentation and making kimchi. I learned a lot about Japanese fermentation, and in Japan they have the most varied kinds of pickles, sukemono, and all kinds of different pickling media. They in addition to a saltwater brine, in Japan they'll pickle in rice bran, they'll pickle in sake lees, the sort of rice and yeast and bacteria residue of sake making. They'll ferment in soy sauce, they'll ferment in miso, but you just find this extraordinary range of different vegetables. But fermentation in China remained a real mystery for me. And I just wasn't able to find any detailed information in English about it. And last year, a Chinese-American student of mine who had grown up in Hong Kong, and her Chinese mother, who has lived all of her life in Hong Kong, invited me to come with them to travel a little bit through China. And our major destination was a little village in the province of Guizhou, where Judy, my friend's mother, had some long-standing relationships and had visited many times through the years and observed some of their fermentation and always told my friend Mara about it, and they invited me to come along to learn about it. And so I learned, basically some simple methods for fermenting vegetables. I mean, I saw lots of other fascinating things. I learned about making alcoholic beverages from rice, both fermented ones and also distilled ones from that. I learned about pickling fish in rice and pickling pork in rice. I learned about different ways of fermenting soybeans into some condiments that they enjoy. But I mean, really, like the most interesting thing to me, ultimately, also about fermenting tofu, which is just incredible and so varied. But I'm enjoying showing people the simple Chinese way of fermenting vegetables, pao cai. And of course, there's not one way. There's not one way of doing any of this. Sauerkraut. I was in Poland a couple weeks ago teaching a workshop, and I had students from some different parts of the country, and like they were arguing about what the appropriate spices to put in sauerkraut are, because in different parts of the country there's just different sort of traditional ideas about spicing it. In Korea, where literally most people are eating kimchi with every meal, it's not like all the kimchi is the same. I mean, there's different regional styles, there's seasonal styles. Ultimately it just comes down to family recipes. Like, every grandma has her own little twist that she puts on it. So like none of these traditions are done in a singular way. These are traditions that have just sort of spread over such vast geographical areas that there's lots of different ideas. So in the Chinese pao cai, generally it seems like people make a brine and then keep working with the brine. So this is simply a brine. This is just water with roughly 5% salt and roughly 5% sugar. I just happened to find the bin with the brown sugar, and so that's why it looks like this, because I use brown sugar. In China, everyone was talking about this, they would call it ding sugar. And it was these you'll never find ding sugar. I mean, maybe there's a Chinese shop somewhere you will find ding sugar. I'm very skeptical. It's called ding because there are these roving vendors selling this sugar in a very particular form. It looks like Turkish taffy. It's sort of like it's brittle, but then it can stretch. And so the ding is the way that the vendors sell it is they use a chisel and a hammer to break off pieces of it, and they walk around the street letting people know they're walking through by dinging the hammer against the chisel. And so everyone we met who talked about it said a ding. I mean, I don't remember what the Chinese word for sugar was, but they would all say ding to describe it. And it's actually, as we researched it turns out it was a barley malt based sweetener. I'll tell you, in my own practice, I just never put sugar in my fermented vegetables. But just in trying to sort of learn this method, I've been experimenting with sugar. I mean, really, the sugar doesn't stay sugar; it just makes it ferment much faster, and it makes it much more acidic. A brine like that, and then the seasoning that really blew my mind was licorice. And it just adds this whole different quality to the pickles. And so here's just a couple of pieces of licorice. At home I get the licorice that's more cut up, like what you could make a little decoction of tea, and I think the flavor comes out more easily. It's very hard to cut this. If I had a saw, I might saw this into a few more pieces. But really, that's my bad. The flavor is just gonna infuse into there. It's totally fine. It's gonna work out. Then I'm gonna put a little bit of ginger. I'm going to put a little bit of the Sichuan peppercorns that are not so much spicy as numbing. I'm going to put a little bit of star anise. But I'll tell you, I saw people using spices that sometimes I just had no idea what they were. So it's not as if there's one set of spices. It really seems like this is something where every family had their own unique combination of spices that they would use. I'm going to put in a couple of chili peppers. So that's basically the brine solution, is the salt and sugar brine, with this kind of spicing in it. And then you want to add some vegetables to ferment. And, I mostly like to stick with pretty simple vegetables. This is, I think you call it a mouli here. We call it a daikon radish. A big white radish. You could use you could use little red, breakfast radish kinds of things just as well. You can put any vegetable you want in here. Don't imagine that only certain vegetables lend themselves to fermentation. There's some carrots. Here's some pieces of cabbage. I'm going to put these big, heavy pieces of cabbage on top in an attempt to kind of weight everything down. I mean, this is one of the sort of challenges of fermentation. It's like keeping the stuff below the brine. The whole idea of having the vegetables in a brine is so that molds don't grow and they don't decompose. But as anyone who's ever experimented with this at home has discovered, the big challenge is holding everything under the brine. So if I do this in a big open vessel, and I do a lot of things in like 5-gallon crocks, or I've done things in 55-gallon wooden oak barrels. Right now I have a 200-liter cylinder. So there's a lot of different improvisational strategies you can do. You can also just leave it on your kitchen counter and commit yourself to every day or two, pressing it down. And you can just do it manually if you're doing, if you can leave it in your kitchen. Like, historically people wouldn't do this in their kitchen because they want it to be in a cool place. So it would be like in a cellar, or in a barn, or a place that stayed cool. But I think for a shorter term fermentation, just having it in your visual field is incredibly helpful, because you'll just remember to like off-gas it, release the pressure that'll build up, especially in the first few days. You can just go ahead and press everything down. This is generally, as far as I can tell, done in contemporary China mostly as a short-term process. So once you have a brine that's developed its acidity and flavor, you can put veggies in just for a day or two. Obviously, over time, some of the salt is going to migrate out. Some of the flavor of the spices is going to migrate out. So you have to refresh the brine. You have to add. You don't necessarily have to add water, because always the vegetables will release water. So you might have to pour some of the liquid out over time, but you'll need to add a little bit of salt to maintain a pleasant level of salinity. Over time you'll need to add a little bit more spices. You can experiment and add other spices. I saw garlic, I saw jujube, I saw all kinds of Chinese medicinal spices, but I have no idea what their names are. But it seemed like this was a very, very varied kind of a process, palate side. I just want to sort of connect this to this ethos of zero waste food that this restaurant really represents. But I just want to talk about the word fermentation. And the word fermentation comes from the Latin fervere, which means to boil. And it's because the visible action of fermentation in liquids is the bubbles, just like the visible action of boiling in liquids. And the word yeast in English has exactly the same story, except through Greek. Yeast comes from Greek zestos, which means to boil. So fermentation has always been understood and observed by the visible action. Because what was causing it was invisible, but their byproduct was visible, was the bubbles. Well, in our language, we use the word fermentation in very interesting metaphorical ways as well. So, we might talk about a place or a time of great cultural ferment, political ferment, social ferment, intellectual ferment. I saw a reference a couple months ago to spiritual ferment. But what they all have in common is that it's about the bubbles, except instead of literal bubbles of carbon dioxide rising in a fermenting liquid, it's like bubbly excitement. When there's some kind of idea that is just getting you excited, you become bubbly, you become irrepressible. You want to share your excitement about whatever that idea might be. So in addition to being this essential mode of transformation for foods and beverages, fermentation is also an engine of social change. And really we are the starter cultures. So I thank you all for your interest in this. And now, we have some time. I don't know exactly how long we have, but until, Darren or Doug or someone pulls the plug, we'll just see what kind of questions are.
I was just going to say things with koji. How would you go about that process? Have you got beans and stuff, vegetables?
So koji is rice or barley or other grains grown with a mold, Aspergillus oryzae. I mean, my preference is unrefined sea salts, but any kind of fruit that you have access to in abundance, you know, you can make wine out of it.